Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Today, our guest is Philip Kitcher. He's the John Dewey Professor of Philosophy at Columbia University. He's the author of On John Stuart Mill, published by the Columbia University Press, and it will be released on January 17th. He used to be primarily interested in the philosophy of mathematics and the general philosophy of science, which is fascinating. I could ask questions for a month on all these topics. He then moved on to the philosophy of biology, and this is fascinating as well, to the questions about the relation between biological research to society and politics, and continuing to move on to pragmatism and naturalistic ethics, philosophical themes in literature and music, including that part about Thomas Mann, which is amazing. Some of his recent works are The Ethical Project, Science in a Democratic Society. We'll see how that goes. Prelude to Pragmatism, Philosophy of Science and Deaths in Venice, as I said, Thomas Mann, as well as works on Joyce, Ulysses, and Finnegans Wake, which we were just discussing. Late last year, his book, What's the Use of Philosophy, reached our shop, posing a question that many of our patrons have asked me over the years. So instead of listening to me blab, I can just come out from around the corner and just hand them the book. So now most of us know who John Stuart Mill is, maybe from Econ 101, the economist, the humanist, the lecturer. Maybe we even know that he worked for the East India Tea Company and was a member of parliament. But that doesn't tell us, and we most likely don't know, who John Stuart actually was and why he was and his work is important to our society still today. So that basically is what the question posed is answered in this book, from topics such as COVID to the Second Amendment, to gay rights. And you got to remember, John Stuart Mill was one of the first people who advocated for women's rights and suffrage. So welcome, Philip. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Well, let's start off at the start off. In the preface, which is great, you say you have a dream job. Why do you say you have a dream job?
Well, actually, the job that I had that was the dream job was when I was, for a 3-year period, in charge of Columbia's great core course, Contemporary Civilization. And you may know this about the Columbia General Education Program. It was founded in 1919, I think, this particular course, because it was felt that people coming back from the First World War ought to know what they've been fighting for. And so it's a mixture of political theory, ethics, concerns with religion, some social science, and it's been for over a century now, this great course taken by all Columbia sophomores in small sections, and it's very oriented towards discussion. And I not only taught in this course, but I had the privilege to run it that is, be the nominal person who was in charge. There are, of course, many people involved in running it for a 3-year period. And that involves sort of talking to the people who lead the sections, whether they're faculty or graduate student preceptors, and going through the various texts and trying to sort of help people understand ways of teaching them. And Columbia University Press decided to celebrate the centennial of this course by having a book series about the individual authors and texts on the syllabi for this course and its predecessor, Literature Humanities, which is taken by Columbia freshmen. So I volunteered to write a book about one of my intellectual heroes, John Stuart Mill. And I set out in this to sort of rebut the idea that we don't need books about Mill because, he's old hat. He tells us that freedom is a good thing, talks about freedom of the press, classic discussion of freedom of the press, of course. But we've absorbed all of that. We don't need any more of it. I don't think that's true. I think Mill is a much more radical thinker and a much more progressive thinker than he's often portrayed as being. And what I try to do in this book is to talk about the way in which Mill is progressive and the way in which he speaks to our times. So my dream job was running this course, and as you can tell, I'm quite enthusiastic about it and about the general program that it's part of.
Oh, that comes through in the preface and the book, as well as your sense of humor. When you talk about the fact that no one really cares about what a wedding cake tastes like. But another question prefatory is, you talk about this, again, in a humorous fashion, the idea of Mill for dummies. And of course, I can identify with that because it really helped me out. But the other question is this concept of core, like many of the terms, whether it's utility or consequentialism, these meanings have kind of morphed over the years. So some people hear core curriculum and they think, oh, this is the canon. We don't need these people anymore. Or they don't, or both the left and the right misinterpret the concept of core. So maybe you could define that a little better so that, especially my patrons at the bookshop, understand why it is core.
It's a living thing. And there's a serious attempt, in fact, it happens every 2 years, to rethink what should be there, what kinds of works are most important for today's undergraduates to come to terms with. And so there's constant discussion of what kinds of things are needed to create a proper balance of texts for students, given the kinds of interests that they are showing and the kinds of issues that are arising for them and for the society into which they will go. And so there are very, very few books that have endured on the Columbia course syllabus over the years. Very, very few authors indeed have always been there. I think the Bible is often, is pretty constant, but the Quran was not part of the syllabus until relatively recently. I think, some of Augustine's writings have probably been around for quite a long time on the core. But there are lots of things that sort of come and go. I mean, at the moment, I'm very pleased to say that this is a canon that people who took the course, say, a decade ago or 2 decades ago would say, oh, that's different. That's different from what I would. And that's because it's an evolving thing. And there is this really, really very serious attempt to respond to the educational needs that we recognize in our students.
Well, I guess it's time to go to the person himself. And I guess as a start, let's talk about his actual life, his father, the relationship with Bentham, his wife. Let's do that for a couple of minutes.
Okay, so Jeremy Bentham was a very eccentric man. I think we can agree on that. I mean, he did, after all, get himself stuffed so he could be wheeled out in a glass case at meetings of the University College London Senate. He was a very eccentric man, but he had this great idea, that everybody was to count for one and none was to count for more than one. And it's a response really to the nascent Industrial Revolution, I think. So he had this thought that the kind of ethics and social framework that was going on in late 18th century England was desperately unfair, and that lots of people were being thrust into poverty. And many people sort of gravitated to Bentham's political, social, ethical program. And one of them was John Stuart Mill's father, James Mill. And when John Stuart was born in 1806, the elder Mill, James Mill, decided that he would bring up his son to be, the next generation's apostle of radical reform in Britain. And indeed, actually, he succeeded, but not quite in the way that he thought he was going to. Anyway, so he started John Stuart on Greek at 3, and Latin and Hebrew came later, I think about 6 or 7. And when John Stuart was about 11 or 12, he learnt what political economy, as it was then called, what we would call economics. And that consisted in giving young John Stuart the works of the leading economists of the time, David Ricardo. And John Stuart made his name intellectually by doing what his father gave him as homework exercises, namely solving the unsolved problems that Ricardo hadn't managed to solve. So this was a really fierce and monstrous education in many ways, and it led Mill to a breakdown when he was about 20. He recovered from that breakdown by discovering, as he puts it, first the poetry of Wordsworth. Poetry had not figured much in his education at his father's hands, and then by meeting a woman, Harriet Taylor, who became the love of his life. Unfortunately, she was already married at the time, but he was an absolutely devoted lover, and she loved him in return. There is speculation about how far it went, but the letters are incredibly passionate. And after Mr. Taylor had the good graces to die, they got married, and John Stuart adopted Harriet's daughter by her first marriage. And after she died, he and his adopted daughter then went to Avignon every year for several weeks and months at a time so that he could be by her grave. I mean, this is an incredibly beautiful love story. I mean, it is, of course, a Victorian love story, so it's not quite as explicit as it would be on social media today, but it's a very moving and beautiful story. And he never worked as an academic.
Anyone writes in a letter, "Last night was wonderful."
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the letters are incredible, absolutely incredible, given the conventions of the time. You love me just as I want to be loved. Oh, my dear one, I have to write this letter now. I know I'm going to see you, but I couldn't wait. It's just amazing. Anyway, so look, Mill was never an academic. He worked, as you say, for the East India Company. He was a really serious public intellectual who was read by everybody. I mean, revolutionary French socialists, Italian radicals, George Eliot, the novelist, Gladstone called him, the saint of rationality. It's just amazing, the interest in his views. And he ran for parliament, telling the workers in his constituency that he would not support some of their causes, but he would support others, and pledging that he would campaign for women's votes, which he did, and was more successful than he and anybody else anticipated being. So, I mean, an amazing life, actually.
Do you think, I think a lot of what I want to talk about, obviously, is utility. Do you think he would have broken from Bentham if Bentham was still alive when he began to do that?
Yeah, okay, so it's interesting. So Mill writes in the late 1830s, after his father is dead and after Bentham is dead, these two essays, one on Bentham and one on Coleridge, who was the sort of bête noire for the Benthamite progressive wing. And he says, look, both of these guys have something going for them, but they're both blind. Coleridge doesn't recognize sufficiently what Bentham sees so clearly, that each person counts for one and none for more than one. And Bentham has no clue about the full range of human life and human emotion. I mean, I think that's Mill's sort of cri de coeur after going through this incredible depression that was caused by the monstrous education that his father gave him. So what happens is, I think, that he sees Bentham's psychology as utterly wanting and utterly narrow, and he breaks with it. He goes in a different direction.
Well, if you go back to Hume and then Bentham and then Mill, this concept of utilitarianism has morphed in so many different ways that no one today can easily grasp the concept. Let me pose a hypothetical and then you can go off on it.
Okay, good.
So suppose there's a kid. He's nice. He's a very good person, means well, pleasant to other people. he has a good job, he has avocations, and this goes into the lower and higher pleasures. And suppose he comes into a great deal of money, unexpectedly. And with that money, he slows down a little bit on his job, but he still works 3 days a week, whatever, like everybody. And then his avocation becomes, he wants to, whatever, ski. He wants to ski every day that he can. And he also begins to travel, first class, stays in the best hotels, enjoys the culture of the countries that he visits. So if you look at each of these three guys, and suppose he gives to charity as well. So where am I?
So what you want is a conception of utility that embraces all the dimensions of human life. And of course, the story you've just told is one in which somebody gets a lot of pleasure and a lot of ease from what he does. But the real question, I think, is to what extent does that pay off in contributing to the lives of others? I think Mill's notion of utility is actually very oriented towards the overall betterment of mankind. So what he says in On Liberty, the most famous book he wrote, actually, is, I'm not going to rely in talking about liberty on rights in the way that people then and now often do. I have a right to this, I have a right to that, and hence I need certain kinds of freedoms and liberties that go along with it. He said, no, I'm not going to do that. I am only going to make an appeal to utility. And then he says, but it must be utility in the largest sense. And that's such an important phrase, because what he's doing is he's distancing himself from the narrow conception of, I get a lot of pleasure out of traveling. I get a lot of pleasure about flying first class rather than in the cabin. He's getting away from that and towards something else. And what he then says, this largest sense, is the permanent interests of man as a progressive being. And that's an incredibly cloudy and difficult phrase. But I suggest, and this is the approach of the entire book, that we actually look not at, the definition of utility that we might think is in utilitarianism, but at this cloudy notion of the permanent interests of man as a progressive being, and make it concrete by looking at the way in which Mill addresses certain kinds of social problems. What is it that he thinks are the most important? And so he thinks that, in fact, this comes very strongly in his economic writings. He thinks that the idea of permanent inequalities are a bad thing for two reasons. Because some people are too poor to, as it were, make the kinds of choices that they would and achieve the kinds of goals they set for themselves. And some people are pampered and spoiled, and therefore do not exert themselves for humanity in the way that they should. So to go back to your story, everything turns on where this guy sits on that spectrum. Does he become one of the pampered rich who sort of gets lots of pleasure for himself but doesn't contribute much? Or does it spur him to a kind of other-directed, socially directed activity? Because I think Mill would say the utility of his life actually depends on what he does with the money. And if the first-class travel is just a means to enable him to have the energy to do vast amounts of social good, then Mill would say, right on. But if it's purely self-directed, I think Mill would be upset with what's happened to this guy.
Well, let me take a different position then, because it goes to the lower pleasures and the higher pleasures, which is a kind of Aristotic kind of look at it. Suppose you do have the plowman, and he enjoys his plowman's lunch, and then every Friday he goes out to the pub, and everyone loves him. He's a great guy. He's very entertaining. He has a lovely life. His wife and he have a wonderful relationship. He has great children. He teaches them. He sits them on his knee. He reads to them. What's wrong with that?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I mean, he's doing an awful lot of good. I mean, it depends, of course, whether he can provide for his children an opening of their horizons. If what he does for them is simply, to think of them within the framework that he has sort of developed for his own life, then there are certain shortcomings of what he's done. But we shouldn't underrate the good that he actually has done. But if you take Mill very seriously in On Liberty, where he says the only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we don't interfere with the good of others. If you take that idea seriously, then part of the duty of being a parent is to try to help your children to do that. So if the plowman confines the children, then something is lacking, even though he may have done all sorts of good things for them. But it didn't sound like that. Your plowman was other directed. He was amusing other people at the pub. He was making communal pleasure, if you like. And with respect to his children, he was teaching them to read and, reading to them and trying in that way to expand their horizons. So I think he comes across a pretty good guy.
And I like him. I like those kind of guys. I like spending time with them.
Yes, I do too. And Mill does too. I think Mill does not want everybody to sort of be concentrating on high art or, scientific research. He sees the value of all kinds of lives. He's quite pluralistic about it.
Why does the right attempt to embrace him in the sense that they equate utility to hedonism? And why has it been equated to hedonism?
Okay, so many people read Mill by saying utilitarianism is the founding text. That's where Mill gives us his ethical framework. And so I've read any number of books that begin by saying, well, let's do utilitarianism first. And then we will get Mill's basic sort of ethical framework. And then we can take that into various social situations. So if you actually, if you read it that way, then there's a lot of temptation to take him as having a simple sort of rather simple-minded psychology drawn from Bentham, for which he brings a distinction that then gives it an elitist twist. And that kind of Mill is easily co-opted by the right. But not the Mill who said utility in the largest sense, the permanent interests of man as a progressive being. That Mill can't be corralled so easily. And anybody who reads the address that he gave as rector to the University of St. Andrews, and then goes on to read the Principles of Political Economy, can't really fail to see the attempt, which he's really a very progressive guy. He's basically, he would belong in something like a Scandinavian or Dutch or German Social Democratic Party. He would belong in the old British Labour Party before it did the Blairite compromise. He's into social institutions that help people and that promote the living of all. That's what he wants. That's what he inherits from Bentham, the idea that everybody counts, each to count for one and none for more than one. It's just that he has a different and much richer sense of what counting means. And it's, I think, a very attractive, he's a very, very attractive social and political thinker. And it shows up, of course, in his interest in women's lives.
Yeah, which again goes to the present, which you bring. Well, okay, well, we will talk about the fact that you wrote this essentially during COVID and your statements about AR-15s blowing deer into tiny, which is humorous but tragic.
Yes.
So here's the problem I have with, I guess, academia in this sense. One time you said the judges no doubt have read John Stuart Mill. No way, I think. Secondly, it's the idea that you're writing this book and I and my patrons understand it. Not to give myself any specific credit. We agree with your tenets, but Donald Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene are not reading this book. They don't know anything about
Well, it might do them some good, actually. But
it would do them a world of good. But that's the question about being an academic. Do you even think in your wildest dreams that somehow your book is going to persuade them? And if not, then how can they be helped by it? That's
okay.
That happens all the time.
First of all, I'm going to push back on the judges haven't read Mill. Where do judges come from? They come from elite law schools.
Donald Trump has appointed a third of them.
Well, yeah, but they still come, many of those still come from pretty good law schools. I mean, and those people have read Mill. And Mill is regular. I mean, Columbia law students have hefty doses of On Liberty all the time.
Well, I'm sure Ted Cruz did too. And I'm sure, the Republicans have co-opted Ayn Rand.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really help. It seems to hurt. I don't want to.
I'm not so skeptical about this. I do believe in the power of ideas. And I do believe that getting people who are already, my target audience for this book is not Donald Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene. It's people like you who might have been inclined to dismiss Mill as a fuddy-duddy, somebody we don't need anymore. Old white guy talking about liberty in this very elitist way, and perhaps even if you've read the wrong people, you might think of him as a sort of hyper-libertarian. He isn't at all. I mean, he's a serious egalitarian. So now what you've got is in Mill a series of ideas that are helpful for framing contemporary debates, which can be used by progressive people in their arguments with perhaps not Marjorie Taylor Greene and Donald Trump, since they may be beyond argument, but whatever residual members of the Republican Party still are open.
Well, that's assuming
to serious discussion.
That's assuming that, and this goes back to all from Hume to today. That's assuming that there's what we're doing, civil discourse. But in this country today,
well, I mean, this is part of my larger and more general philosophical project, is to reinstitute something like civil discourse. So many of the things I write about in my work that's on ethics, in my book Moral Progress, and in my older book The Ethical Project, are really about trying to improve people's abilities to deliberate with one another. I'm part of this. Sorry.
I was going to say there's a perfect example in your book of how that might. Well, there's two: the doctors, which we can get to, but the Supreme Court case regarding the cake maker.
Yeah. Right. Yes.
About that. Let's talk about that. That's really interesting, and that would bring the lay reader to a good understanding of what you're writing about.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So I consider this the situation. I mean, one of the great triumphs of On Liberty as a book was something that occurred in the 1950s and 1960s in Britain. First of all, the Wolfenden Commission leaned heavily on Mill's On Liberty in decriminalizing male homosexuality. I'm told that female same-sex relations weren't decriminalized because Queen Victoria apparently thought that that was unnecessary because women wouldn't do that sort of thing. But anyway, so the Wolfenden Commission was set up. It appealed to on liberty, and a decade later, the sodomy laws, the anti-homosexuality laws were repealed in Britain. And of course, ever since then, there's been this tremendous progress in our understanding of same-sex love, which is, I think, the right way to think about it. The love that used not to be able to speak its name, but now is a bit more able to speak its name than it used to be.
Well, then that goes to what I was trying to get at, is this idea of moving towards civil discourse. The baker and his wife refused. They were devout Christians.
Right. So now we come up with situations in which people who are of the same sex can get married to one another. And now we have profoundly religious, fundamentalist religious people who say this is an abomination, it shouldn't be happening, I want no part of it, it would be sinful of me to acquiesce in facilitating this. So I'm a baker, and I'm asked to make a wedding cake for a gay wedding, and I say, no, I can't do that. And now, the people who've asked me feel understandably that this is another chapter in the long history of discrimination against people who love members of the same sex. And so you have a conflict, which isn't just, on the surface, it's trivial, right?
It is.
On the surface, it's trivial. Because why can't they just sort of go somewhere else and get their cake? But no, it's got much greater significance than that. Because in my story, it's two men. The men involved, this is just another indication of the discrimination that has been felt by them and by people like them for decades. Whereas for the other side, it's about a fundamental life issue, namely not violating the commands of the deity. So how on earth can so however it comes out, one of these parties is going to feel profoundly unhappy. So how do we get beyond this? Well, I suggest through a kind of mediation. And the mediation is done in my story by somebody who's unusually altruistic, sympathetic, and able to bring the parties together. And as they converse, they come to view one another differently. The bakers come to see the two men as having some features of the relationship that exists in their own marriage. And on the other side, the guys come to see this sort of sincerity in what they think of as a rather misguided faith. They themselves are religious, but don't sort of subscribe to the fundamentalism that the bakers espouse. But they come to recognize one another. And so the conclusion in my story is when is that they find a compromise, and each side compromises. The guys say, all right, we're going to go somewhere else. We don't want to trouble you with this. We understand your religious sensibilities. The bakers say, well, we can't bake you a cake, but there are lots of cakes we have in our shop. Come along to our shop, get an undecorated cake and take it somewhere else. And when those emails cross in my story, and at that point, they all laugh. And how do they settle it? Well, the mediator, who's actually based on somebody, a wonderful student I once taught, the mediator flips a coin. So that's an attempt to take something which is an incredibly heated and polarizing issue and bring it into the realm of civil discourse. Can we always do that? Probably not. But we can make progress with respect to civil discourse, and that I think Mill would see, and I would see.
Well, if we're talking about action thought within 3 to 5 ethical norms, let's talk about something even more trivial: the use of pronouns, for example.
Yeah.
I won't use the pronoun they. I find it, I don't know, I don't like sacrificing grammar for the rights of others. And I understand completely their position, but all I want is for them to understand mine.
Yeah.
And I can't see that that's about to happen in the world today.
Probably not, but you know, I think it would be. You seem to me like the sort of guy who would be actually quite good in a civil discourse situation.
Hope so.
So why don't we try to find some equally open-minded and thoughtful people who really think pronouns are very important, and you know, a couple of you can have a conversation.
I have, and
see how it comes out, and how. I mean, did you get anywhere or not?
I did, but then I brought up like J.K. Rowling and what's been done to her.
Yeah.
And then their response is, but, well, it's like the cast of Harry Potter who would be nowhere today, condemning her. And
yeah.
Yeah, things like that.
I've actually had that conversation also with people, because I mean, I'm not sure I agree with Rowling's position, but I think there has been a lot of dumping on her as a result of some of the things that she said. I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that these things can be worked through. We can come away with perhaps not agreement, but a sense of this as not being a battle that is worth fighting anymore. It's on both sides, and a sense of having been understood. So, I mean, I think civil discourse depends on the fact that one can sometimes produce the following reaction: I continue to disagree with what you say, but I do see why you say it. And I see also that you disagree with me, and you understand why I say what I say.
Well, if the point of the book is to bring Mill into the present, let's take a couple of things like that and say, okay, if he was here, if he was an old white man like both of us,
yeah,
although you have 5 years on me.
I do. Yeah. All right, don't you get uppity, young man.
We can discuss that. So if he was here, and there's a third little box in the Zoom window. Yeah, there you go. What would he say?
I hope he would say to me that, you know, I think you've gotten some things. You've got some things out of my writings that other people haven't seen in them, and I like what you've done with me. It's not the only way to read my writings. Of course, I say at the end of the book that I think that there are a number of ways to read any great philosophical text, so I would that would begin with that. And I don't know what he would say on the pronoun issue. I don't know at all. I couldn't guess. And he might say, well, you know, I think what I really want to do on is use they on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and he or she on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, and on Sundays I shall avoid the subject entirely.
But my next question was going to be, okay, we have the third window with Mill there. Let's delete him, which is another bad word, improper word. Let's move him out of the picture and put Hume in. And what would Hume say then? He's the precursor. He had a different opinion. Mill changed. There's the word, changed.
Well, I don't think of Hume as a utilitarian. I actually think of him as a sentimentalist. In fact, I think it's Hume who's Bentham's target. I think when if you ever read Hume's account or an inquiry into the theory of morals, it's a beautifully written book, but it's absolutely appalling. You know, I mean, it's all about things like, you know, our regard for wealth and affability. And, you know, you want to say, this guy has a sort of moral perspective that is completely divorced from the kind of world that is coming to be in the 18th century. He doesn't give a fig for those people who are being, you know, starved in their cottage industries and forced to move to the towns and live in squalid conditions and work in factories 14 hours a day. You know, he's fond of his sort of upper class mates with whom he hangs around in Edinburgh, and the chaps at the club, you know, they're terribly fun to be with, and I'm very sympathetic with them. And that's the position that I think of Bentham and Mill as wanting to oppose, because it violates that fundamental idea of everybody counting the same.
That's why I was asking it, because Hume would have a different opinion of our young, affluent, good person who's traveling about the world as a jet setter.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, absolutely admirable. And probably unsympathetic to the person who wants us to use they. Probably on your side of that one. So reflect on the fact that that you're there with Hume, the eminently clubbable David Hume.
I think I'm getting the short end of the stick here, but that's okay. That's what makes a good conversation.
Yeah.
Well, let's go to another. Well, there's two examples. One's much more gruesome than the other. The Secret Santa and the 13 doctors on the beach, desert island, because that brings all this, you know, people will understand these very well.
Okay, so I mean, instead of starting with Mill's utilitarianism, alleged utilitarianism, I end with it. And I suggest at the end that actually, despite the fact that he wrote a book called Utilitarianism, which is standardly used to teach people utilitarianism, Mill wasn't a utilitarianism at all. He was a consequentialist. That is, somebody who thinks that actions should be evaluated in terms of their consequences. But he's not an aggregative consequentialist. That is, he doesn't think that you find out what's good and what's bad by decomposing situations into little bits and pieces and then adding up. He thinks of things differently. So the classic example that's often used to attack utilitarianism is the so-called, you know, the plane crash and desert island scenario, right? So you've got this group of people, they're on a plane and it crashes, and they manage somehow to survive on a desert island, and they're all suffering from different conditions, except one of them who's perfectly healthy. So in my version of the story, there are 13 people. Got one who's completely healthy, and another one who needs a kidney transplant, another one who needs a heart transplant, another one who needs a liver transplant, and the standard attack on utilitarianism says, well, you see, if you carved up the body of the healthy one and used all the organs, you could save everybody. So we should do that. But I say, no, that's not the way Mill would see it, because Mill would make this idea of free action and informed free action fundamental to what's right. So instead of thinking that the 12 should simply pounce on the one and get out their scalpels, they're all surgeons, by the way, in my version of the story. He thinks that they should sort of talk to one another. In fact, they should say to the guy who's healthy, look, what are we going to do here? Would you be willing to give your body to the rest of us? And if the guy says no, then they have a more general conversation. can we find a way to save some of us at least? And if they get to the stage where nobody is willing, then I expect somebody at one point to say something like, well, since we're all so unwilling to sacrifice ourselves for one another, maybe actually none of us deserves to survive. And that to produce a realization and to break down the unwillingness. And then at that point, maybe somebody suggests, well, look, let's draw straws. Let's just do it randomly, give everybody an equal chance. And then at that point, the guy who's healthy says, look, this is silly. I understand that, we've talked about this. There's a possibility that some of you may be able to be saved and go back and live your normal lives. And you've made it pretty clear to me that you regard what you're asking of any of us as being a huge sacrifice. Having thought this over, I'm willing to make the sacrifice.
What about an example that's almost could be solipsistic, assuming your actions don't change, notwithstanding the fact that you constitute the entire universe and one of us is talking to the other, but the other doesn't exist. The simplest example is, the guy with the switch by the railroad track. They're 12 tied down on one side. There's one person on the other. He's not there with a bunch of people trying to create a solution. He has the switch. He has 5 seconds. He either allows, he has the choice to allow 12 people to survive, or
so I have a lot of, I've taught this case any number of times, right? And it's always the same. You get a bunch of very smart 20-year-olds in a room, and you say to them, okay, so what's the right thing to do? Some of them, having taken a philosophy course before, may be prepared to answer, but most of them go, they shift around very uneasily. So you look at them hard and you say, so you got to make some decision here. What would you do? And they say, well, actually, if I were there by the track, I would try to find a way of saving everybody. I say, oh, no, you can't do that. Well, why not? And then somebody gets the point, which is that this sort of example is phony in a certain respect, because we are never in the situation of feeling absolutely certain. So if I asked you what you would do if you really came across a track with 12 people on one track, one on another, and saw that there was a switch that could change, I think what you would say is, well, I try to find some way of stopping the trolley.
Not if you had 5 seconds.
And
5 seconds. What if you have a mule caught between haystacks? There's 12 haystacks on one side and 1 haystack on the other. If the mule was smart enough, he's going to go to the 12 haystacks.
No, I mean, look, these examples tend to be artificial because we're never in the situation where we're absolutely certain about these things. And so I think our retrospective response is to say, well, it's probably better to throw the switch than not to. But it's somehow wrong to think of either of these outcomes as good or the right thing to do. I mean, if you throw the switch, you're still consigning the one guy, to his fate. This is what I think of as a kind of asymmetric dilemma. It's a case in which you think of one outcome as better than the other, but you regard neither of them as really satisfactory.
Well, not to be more exasperating than I usually am, but it's these examples that you should be proud of, because I'm thinking of them because of your book. And that's why people will buy your book, which is part of the reason we're here. And it will be on the front table in my bookstore, and they'll probably be in our nonfiction book club. It'll probably be, and actually, I like to call it Fight Club, because they're either side and they're going to make the same argument. But what about if Harry Truman, he decides to drop the bomb on Hiroshima? he makes the moral decision, and it is a moral decision.
Yep.
What about that one?
I'm inclined to, I mean, there are also, there's a huge backstory about this, which I didn't know about until recently, and I don't really know all the details of it, and I don't know whether the version of the story that I've now been told is completely accurate. But the backstory is that the decision was not made for morally correct reason.
Correct, especially Nagasaki.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me actually a moral blunder on Truman's part, and this is in a way.
I don't know.
This is a political decision, and not, and I think morality has very little to do with it. And we should be ashamed of it. I mean, just as we should be ashamed of shock and awe in Iraq, which of course has made our moral stance with respect to Ukraine so much more complicated.
Well, you talk about a moral blunder. What is a moral blunder, and can you be saved if you can?
Well, it's hard to imagine people who at least once in their lives don't make some moral blunder or anything. I mean, we are highly fallible creatures, but we should try to avoid them. A moral blunder is when you do something which is morally wrong, and you really ought to have known or seen or had the will to avoid doing that. And I think Truman should have seen that what he was doing in dropping the bomb was morally wrong. And I think that Bush and Cheney should have seen that what they were doing in Iraq was morally wrong. And those kinds of moral blunders are very visible on the world stage, and they have actually made it difficult for our contemporary politicians to take a moral stance on some issues. So
yeah, but
that is a sad fact.
But I don't think Dick Cheney has the capability or the interest in making a moral decision.
He certainly doesn't have he didn't have the interest in that moral decision. He probably has the interest in making some moral decisions. I mean, remember that this man, for all his moral defects, was quite supportive of his lesbian daughter.
Right.
I mean, the man he's got moral capacities. He just didn't exercise them with respect to the Iraq War. In fact, he went, he trampled all over them.
Yeah, we killed 100,000 innocent men, women, and children who had nothing to do with 9/11, by the way.
Of course not. Of course not. The myth that was promulgated about, Iraqis being involved in acts of terrorism against the United States, viz. 9/11, that was an appalling thing to do. So, I mean, Truman may have done something under the influence of bad advice, I think, that was morally wrong. But Cheney was more of an architect of lots and lots and lots of moral blunders.
He's the incarnation of evil, the crystallization of evil.
No. There are worse.
Yeah, there are worse. Pol Pot. Well, here's what I said to my brother one time, naively. I said, "Why are these elections so close, Bob?" And he goes, "Because half the people believe one thing and half the people believe another. That's why they're decided by 10,000 votes." So I guess in conclusion, okay, you've brought Mill into the present. You've explained why he's still important. And the question is, what, in the end, because the book will be there, and I will be attempting to explain why it's a great book and why you should buy it, what do you expect it to accomplish?
I expect to accomplish I hope to accomplish what Mill accomplished, which is to change people's minds, to open doors for their thinking. That's really what I want to do. This book is intended as, it's intended to replicate what goes on in the classroom. We started with the class, and I think it's appropriate to end with it. The core class is a discussion class. I don't go in and lecture. When I was running the class, I tried to persuade all the people who were running sections that I visited not to lecture. It's a class that's discussion. I try to guide discussion. I try to throw out ideas for people to explore in discussion. And that seems to me an important function of philosophical writing. But what it should do is try to help people see the world and think about issues that are important for them in new ways. It's not a matter of giving them, absolute watertight principles that they can rely on in all contexts. It's about giving them concepts and ways of thinking and forms of argument that they can deploy as they start to reflect on the problems that really matter to them. And that's what I'd like this book to do.
And it's certainly, at least to one person, you've achieved your goal with me. And so I truly appreciate that. And I also appreciate the time you've taken today to speak with me.
Well, I want to thank you for this conversation. It has been, I may say, lots of fun.
I agree. And I always say this is the end and I keep talking, but the sense of humor in your book is part of the reason why it propels the reader throughout. I always enjoy that. So thanks again. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you. Bye now.